Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I think we are live and you are watching us. So welcome to our second webinar for this South Asia campaign. And we have two more people here watching this webinar that you see in the bottom of my screen. And I will let Mrinalini introduce what's going on here.
So, hi everyone. So, I am Mrinalini and I'm the Policy Associate at Climate Tracker, and I am based in India. And we have Anna, who is our campaign coordinator for Climate Tracker, and she's been taking care of our campaigns and organizing all our webinars that you've been attending so far. Our faculty for today, our guest of honor is Mr. Harjeet Singh, who is the global lead on climate change for ActionAid. He's based out of New Delhi, and he's been working with countries across the world on climate change policy and advocacy. And he's managed disaster resilience programs globally and coordinated the emergency response and preparedness work in Asia and the Americas. And until 2007, he led the tsunami response program in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands for ActionAid, and is also associated with the global network of civil society organizations on disaster reduction and with the Climate Action Network International as well. He is one of the founder directors of the Alliance for Adaptation and Disaster Risk Reduction, India, and is presently the chair for the network. So you can imagine that it's a huge honor to have him with us today, and there's nobody better placed to explain to us about the different nuances about the adaptation debate, especially in the South Asian context. So thank you, Harjeet, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So
thank you for having me.
So let's jump into our webinar directly. Like a quick introduction, could you tell us more about what you do at ActionAid and what ActionAid is doing in the context of adaptation right now?
Sure. So ActionAid is an international organization. It's a social justice federation working in over 45 countries. We work on different issues: women's rights, education, humanitarian action, and resilience building. And as part of resilience building, we look at the issues of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation much more closely. So in South Asia, we have been having a long time presence in Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, and India. And after tsunami, we also worked in Sri Lanka for several years. I've been with ActionAid for 14 years, and currently I'm the global lead on climate change for this organization. And I follow the adaptation and loss and damage work at the international level much more closely. And I also support our country programs on their policy engagement at national and local level. So it's about providing them guidance on how to engage at the policy level and how to link the ground level programs with the policy work, and also keeping an eye on the international level developments.
Thank you, Harjeet. That sounds like really interesting. I'm sure our trackers that are listening to this webinar will want to ask you questions. We will explain you how to do this later. Let me just jump to the second question, and then I will explain you that, which is so as you know, this campaign is mainly about climate change adaptation, but of course there's many people that know what is it because they've been engaging with Climate Tracker for a while, and that's a concept they know, but some of them never heard of it before. They may know what climate change is, but not what climate change adaptation stands for. And I'm sure you know very well what is it, so maybe you can give us a brief summary.
Sure. I have been engaging on this issue, so let me share my perspective on that. So UNFCCC defines it as actions that you would take to help communities as well as ecosystems cope with the changing climate condition. Whereas IPCC defines it as adjustment. Adjustment that you need to make in the natural systems or human systems in order to respond to a climate stimuli. It could be actual one, it could be an expected one, and how to deal with the climate effects. Another dimension that IPCC talks about, it's about how the adjustment that we are making is supposed to moderate the harm and also exploit beneficial opportunities. And that's kind of a departure from the way UNFCCC looks at it, because UNFCCC defines it only as a coping mechanism, whereas IPCC goes further and also talks about the beneficial opportunities that adaptation brings it along with it. Um, it applies to all aspects of our lives and ecosystem. And to me, the keywords are long-term and future orientation. In South Asia, a lot of people have been working on disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction. So I think I should also mention that while there is a lot of commonality between disaster risk reduction approaches that we have been applying on all kinds of disasters, but when it comes to adaptation, there are certain differences, where we not only look at the past trends, but we look at the future climatic models much more closely. So we need to understand the difference between the two, while adaptation also builds on the huge amount of work that has happened on disaster risk reduction. So as I said, there's a lot of commonality, but then there's also a difference on how we adopt the work on adaptation on ground.
Okay, that was a great introduction to our webinar actually, and how adaptation in both in the international and at the domestic level has to interact with each other. Which again brings us to our focus area, which is South Asia for this campaign. And since you have such a vast body of experience in South Asia, and the past couple of years, we've been witnessing a lot of unseasonal rainfall, landslides, and several massive environmental disasters. So could you give us some insight on how the South Asian region, apart from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, has been responding to the challenges in adaptation?
So as you rightly said, the number of disasters have increased, their intensity, their frequency. And let us remember, this is all happening as a result of only 1 degree Celsius warming level. And the current political discourse is that we need to keep it below 1.5, and we'll come to that, and the 2 degrees Celsius. But the kind of impacts we have seen are already so devastating. As per the United Nations report last year, which they brought out just before the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction was agreed, they said 90% of the disasters in the last 10 years were climate related, and that's also unprecedented. So number of disasters have increased manyfold. And when you look at South Asia, why it is really important to look at adaptation in South Asia, we're talking of 1.7 billion people who are already facing high temperature, as you said, increasing number of disasters. There are new challenges like rising sea levels and ocean acidification. And this is in a region where 65% of people are living below $3 a day poverty levels, which means that, and we all know that poor people need a lot more time and resources to recover from these impacts. And on top of it, this region also has very high population density levels. So the combination of poverty and now climate change hitting really hard, and then this region also has a lot of security related issues, both within the country and between countries. There are several conflicts still going on. That makes the whole issue extremely complex. Let me just give you one more figure. As per the International Displacement Monitoring Center in Switzerland, 46 million people were displaced by sudden onset disasters just between 2008 and 2013. So you can imagine in those 5 years, 46 million people were displaced, and which clearly indicates how vulnerable the region is. You have high poverty levels, high population density levels, and all kinds of disasters hitting, sudden onset as well as slow onset, as I was describing about sea level rise, ocean acidification, increasing pace of desertification. So and South Asia has been one of the disaster hotspots in the world.
Yeah, definitely. And also, the idea is that there's the social inequality within South Asia. It's just that we've noticed a pattern in the fact that the most vulnerable communities to climate disaster are also the most socially and economically backward. It's the so. Do you have any thoughts on how our current social inequality, whether it's caste-based or financial, of course, how it's affecting adaptation efforts?
See, the way we look at as at ActionAid, the way we look at what makes people vulnerable. I think there are three broad areas. One is social exclusion. In a society, if you're excluded, so we talk about certain sections of society where women have been marginalized. Persons living with disabilities, they are socially excluded. There are certain castes, as you said, or indigenous people who are marginalized in the society. Now, marginalization means that they are not involved in the decision making process, and they also don't have sufficient resources, and that's the second bit. If you don't have access to sufficient natural resources that you would need to survive and thrive, that's what makes you vulnerable. The third set is about access to skills and knowledge. And if I talk about disasters, it's as basic as early warning information. If you don't have in time, that makes you a lot more vulnerable. Or if you don't have knowledge about the climate impacts, or what kind of preparation you need to do, or how you need to change your livelihood system, that makes you vulnerable. And in our societies in South Asia, you would find that there's a combination of two or three of these things, where people who are socially excluded, they don't have access to resources. Not because they don't have access to resources, they continue to remain excluded in the society. And it's like a double whammy, and in some cases triple, because they also then don't get access to information, knowledge, and other kinds of resources. So if in any society where you see social exclusion, that also excludes you from the mainstream economy, and you are not able to take advantage of that, which means you're then stuck in that vicious poverty cycle, and you can never come out of it. And disasters and climate change make it a lot more complex, and they exacerbate your inequality in the society. So then you are stuck in that cycle, and that's what is happening in this region, and we are witnessing it, day in and day out.
Thank you, Harjeet. That's really interesting, and I'm sure people who are writing articles about adaptation in South Asia could use this perspective too, and say, I am not only explaining what happens to the weather or to changes in rainfall patterns, but we also can talk about like human stories of inequality, as you were saying. Let me just like do a brief moment of explaining how people can send us questions, so then we will have them. So trackers that are seeing us, people who are watching this webinar, you can either comment on the page you're watching the webinar. There's like a place to comment. You will see that there's some comments, and Climate Tracker has said something too. You can write that. You can write there your question if you have it in the Google Hangouts page, I think it's called. But if you have Twitter, you can also use Twitter, which is kind of easier maybe. You just tweet at us, which our name is @ClimateTracking. Or if not, use the hashtag Climate Tracker, and we will see your question. So we'll happily ask it to Harjeet later on. But now let me just jump to the next questions and not interrupt more this webinar, which is, we were talking about all this that's happening only with 1 degree of warming. Harjeet, you mentioned that we were only at 1 degree, and we know that, like, I'm sure many people heard about 1.5. They know it's important, but maybe they don't really know what is it. So maybe you can just give a brief introduction about what is 1.5 and why we are really demanding it.
Sure. Ideally speaking, we should have talked about zero warming levels. It's years and decades of inaction has brought us to a stage where we are now actually making a compromise, and saying that, okay, what kind of warming levels we can still afford to cope with, and that's where scientists have guided us that 1 or no, below 2 degree warming levels we can probably live with, but that also brings with a huge impact. And we also know that a lot of people are going to lose their homes, their incomes, their livelihoods, and even their territories. That's why there has been a strong push from the small island states who are far more vulnerable. Let's talk about Maldives in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, where the levels at which they are living, it's just 2 meter above sea level. So they are highly vulnerable. They are investing a lot in planning to shift to other islands that are a few meters above sea level, and so that they can really survive. They can protect their economy. So that's the kind of alarming situation we are dealing with. The reason we are now talking of 1.5, because we have realized that we actually missed the bus of keeping it at probably zero level of warming. We have already reached 1 degree level of warming, and if we are able to make concerted efforts, then there is some chance that we can limit it to 1.5 degree. But the fact is, the current political commitments that we got in Paris, we are actually looking at a 3 to 4 degree warmer world. And if we are serious enough to keep it 1.5, then all the efforts that we are making to keep it to just 2 degree level, we need to double our efforts. And at this stage, unfortunately, the situation looks extremely bleak, and that's why all of us are engaging at the international level to put pressure on the policymakers and politicians to step up the efforts and ramp up their climate action. Now, when we talk about 1.5 degree, on one hand, we need a lot of mitigation effort, reducing our emissions and protecting our forests, and also doing afforestation. But we now have to already start preparing for the impacts, and we have already seen how we are witnessing impacts at just 1 degree temperature rise, which means that we now need to have a plan. How are we going to deal with disasters that we are going to face at different levels of warming? So 1 degree, 1.5, 2. And unfortunately, if it goes beyond that, then we also need to have a plan to deal with that. What we need to remember, that impacts with increasing level of warming are not going to be linear. So 1.5 does not mean 1.5 times of 1 degree impact. The climate system doesn't work that way. The impacts may multiply several times. And we have already seen that extreme weather events have become new normal, which means we need to prepare ourselves a lot more. So our systems, which means that the way we construct our houses need to be changed. Not only looking at that they should not be very energy intensive, but also how they are going to withstand increasing number of cyclones, so increasing number of the flooding events or heat waves. How are we going to construct our houses? Or when we talk about our livelihoods, how are we going to diversify? If one livelihood fails, and this applies particularly to the rural populace, how then you are going to depend on the other one so that you can survive and cope with that. And same applies to all kinds of systems that we have, whether we talk about sanitation system or our own drainage systems and how we are managing our cities. Everything, every aspect of our life now needs to be changed, and impacts are going to increase that we have already experienced. So a lot of political will, one, to keep the temperature level rising below below 1.5, below 2 degrees. At the same time, we need to start preparing for different kinds of impact scenarios that we are going to see, and that's where the whole discussion of also loss and damage comes in, because we will also see that our preparation is not enough to deal with the kind of impacts we are seeing already multiplying compared to the past trends.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, all the examples that you gave of the different levels of change that is required from the public infrastructure level. Do you think we have the kind of infrastructure right now in South Asia to deal with climate migration, especially with the kind of security issues that you brought up earlier in terms of, because all the countries in South Asia aren't on the friendliest terms. So if we have the kind of climate disasters that we are inevitably going to, what if Maldives stops having territory? I mean, this is not as hypothetical anymore. How do we declare its nationhood? What do we deal with climate refugees? So what do you think are climate adaptation strategies with respect to immigration in the 1.5 scenario?
The whole issue of displacement and migration, and there's a new term called human mobility, has now, has been discussed at the UNFCCC level uh, uh, more intensively in the last few COPs, because that issue has become really intense. And let me give you an example. When I was saying that between 2008 and 2013, 46 million people were displaced. Out of that, 26 million people belong to India. 11 million people were displaced in 2010. You must have heard about Pakistan floods that time. And if I talk about future, for Bangladesh, they're going to lose 13% of their landmass by 2050, which means 15 to 20 million people are going to get displaced. And Bangladesh, which is already one of the highly densely populated countries, so Bangladesh will not have space to hold people, people who are going to lose their incomes, and you will see the whole issue of cross-border migration, which is going to make things a lot more complex. So we have seen unprecedented levels of displacement. Let's talk about India. 330 million people were affected by drought this year, and this is official government figure that they submitted to Honorable Supreme Court of India. Uh, eh, Despite that, and that's where it really pains, that we are seeing these impacts. We can, policymakers should easily be able to relate to that with climate change, but still not much action is happening. You were talking of infrastructure. What really is saddening, that sea levels are rising, and if I talk of India, we are talking of a country which has 7,500-kilometer long coastline, but still you find many ports are being constructed without looking at the way sea levels are rising. We are still constructing resorts on the seashore, thinking as if nothing is going to change. But on the other hand, there are scientists have all the predictions how much sea level is going to rise, and how much we need to be moving more inwards. But it's just that policymakers, on one set of policymakers are aware of that, or a large number of scientists are aware of that, but that's not informing the policy making process. And that's what we really need to change, and we need to push for how that knowledge which is being generated at the scientific level need to be used at the political level in the whole planning exercise, and that's not happening. We also need to have all kinds of plans ready. As I was saying, different levels of warming will have different kinds of impacts. So how are we how we need to prepare to deal with those impacts, and we don't find that indication, and there's a lot more window dressing that's happening. Governments are talking about it. There are some governments who are more serious than others. Bangladesh, of course, is way ahead of most of the countries in South Asia, but still the kind of challenge they are going to face, I think a lot more needs to happen. How we need to look at all sectoral plans that are gearing up to deal with the climate crisis that they're already facing, which is going to intensify further in the next few years. So unfortunately, not a lot is happening.
Thank you, and that's a very great lead to my next question, because it was about what's already in place. No? So you are seeing that there's shortage of policy processes of plans. So South Asia needs to be stronger in this. But what do we have already? What are countries, cities at any level doing to adapt to climate change?
Well, what we need to understand, that the work on climate action, or at least discussion on climate action, started much more at the international level. In 2001, when countries started experiencing the impacts, they raised voice. They said, at the UNFCCC level, we can't just be talking about mitigation. We have to look at how we are going to deal with the impacts, and that's where it was agreed that we need to develop some kind of an adaptation plan. And the term that emerged from there, so it was the same Marrakesh, Morocco, where this happened, and they came up with the Marrakesh Accord, and we are going to be having a COP this year in Morocco again. And that's where it was agreed that we should have something called National Adaptation Plan for Action, which was primarily meant for least developed countries. And that's where I would say some kind of concerted action on adaptation started. But then it took more than a decade to see some results of that discussion converting into some kind of a planning exercise in countries. We're talking of 50 odd least developed countries. And unfortunately, the kind of resources that were required and that were committed and promised by developed countries, they didn't come through. And developed and least developed countries, of course, did not have resources to put into this kind of planning process. And it was not just about money. It was a new challenge. New knowledge had to be created. Um, but then they started working on it, and at this stage, majority of least developed countries have national adaptation plans for action, but then they were never funded to implement it. And those plans were about the urgent and immediate actions. So imagine around 15, 16 years have passed, but majority of these plans have not been implemented in total. However, in the last few years, it was also realized that it's not just about immediate and urgent actions. We need to now look at our preparations from medium to longer term, and that's where the terminology of National Adaptation Plan came into being in Cancun a couple of years ago, and that's where it was decided that all countries, because by that time all countries realized that it's not just about least developed countries or poor countries, all countries have to develop their plans. But as per the mandate of the convention, it's developing countries that need to be supported. So that's where the concept of National Adaptation Plan emerged, and as we speak, a lot of countries are developing their National Adaptation Plan. So I would say all is not lost. So there's something positive. Now countries are making efforts to develop national adaptation plans. If I talk about Bangladesh, in fact, Bangladesh did that planning several years ago, and of course they didn't call it National Adaptation Plan at that point of time. They have looked at it, climate change, more comprehensively, because they also included the mitigation efforts. Nepal developed its NAPA, the National Adaptation Plan for Action, the previous one, but they are right now in the process of developing NAP. And I had a chance to talk to government officials. They have got some money now, and they're developing 9 sectoral plans, so there's some action happening. Pakistan did come up with some plan, but not of that level, and they are right now struggling and trying to develop some kind of a plan. India came up with a plan in 2008. They came up with 8 missions, and out of 8, 5 missions do relate to the adaptation part. So there is this process right now happening. And then at the international level, an adaptation committee was set up. There's a which is supposed to coordinate the work and support and look at the gaps. Then we also had Nairobi work program happening, which was more about building the capacity. And in the Paris Agreement, we have now talked about regional centers to be set up wherever required. And these regional centers, and since we are talking of South Asia, I think we really need to start engaging with the international process to make sure that we should have a regional center. While a lot of work has happened in this region on disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management side, so we do have SARC Disaster Management Center, and different parts of that are located in different countries. But we need to see whether that's enough, whether that needs to be scaled up, or we need a completely new regional center in this part of the world. So there are opportunities to ramp up our action on adaptation, linking it with the international processes. And then there are, of course, some bilateral, multilateral funds that are supporting countries to develop their plans. The Green Climate Fund also would be supporting adaptation projects. It's a very slow process at this moment, but yes, eventually we need to be looking at a lot of money flowing from there to assist countries in the adaptation work.
Yeah, I mean, the positive steps by governments are definitely promising, but as our experiences, usually these things take a bit of time, as we've seen in the past so many years during the negotiations. We were wondering if you have come across in your work so far examples at the grassroots level, or local people coming together to adapt, not necessarily with great scientific backing or great financial backing, but using their resources to adapt. So I think we recently saw that a couple of villages in Uttar Pradesh managed to defy the harsher consequences of drought by more judicial water use and less emphasis on water guzzling crops like sugarcane, etc. So have you come across like specific technologies or grassroots efforts regarding adaptation?
Well, there are a number of examples, and not just from India, but from different parts of South Asia. And as I said, some countries are doing better than others. Yeah, I mean, there are examples, as you said, about soil conservation, about water conservation. In fact, on water conservation, now we keep talking of drip irrigation, so that we don't flood the fields, but use drip irrigation to provide water to plants where it's actually required. And there are places in Bundelkhand itself. There are models where they have used bamboo. So instead of depending on the external market on expensive drip irrigation system, they've used it with with local bamboo, and they've created that. There are so there's a lot of movement right now happening to dig ponds so that they can conserve water there. There are examples. I mean, if I talk about ActionAid, the systematic way in which we work. We work with communities to look at the multi-hazard vulnerability analysis, and we identify different kinds of challenges and risks that communities face, and then community members come together to develop a collective action plan. They look at the resources they have. They also analyze what kind of resources they need from the outside. It could be from their local governance system or even beyond. And they also look at their own capacities. And as I was giving example of people using bamboo for drip irrigation, there are a number of such examples. Many communities have been able to change their agriculture system, for example. And as ActionAid, we promote climate resilient, sustainable agriculture, which depends on agroecology, agroecological way of doing agriculture, which means less inputs from outside and using all kinds of local resources, which also means that you become a lot more adaptive. And and if you are not depending on the external resources, you then make the most of your current existing resources. There are examples where communities have diversified their livelihoods. So they've added goatry, or they've added other kinds of livestock which are hardy, and they survive in harsh weather systems. So there are number of examples. Um, on water conservation, there are experiments on how we can use less water in our sanitation systems. And then, of course, the reviving the age-old practices of seed banks and grain banks, so that when you have the crisis, you can borrow seeds. You have a collective way of protecting seeds and using them during crisis times. As ActionAid, we have engaged in Bangladesh, for example, in making handloom, a small handloom, more climate resilient, and looked at different kinds of agriculture systems. So there are a number of examples. So on one hand, we see that impacts are increasing and governments are not doing enough, but people, they have their own autonomous actions that do provide a ray of hope that if we scale up these kind of models, new models that communities have developed, then we will be able to deal with the challenge that we have before us.
Thank you, Harjeet. And I think all these concrete actions, like you were mentioning, on water, on agriculture, make like really good stories for people to explain. So at the end, what we want with this campaign is people to explain stories so people understand climate change and climate change adaptation. So now this question is a bit more for our trackers, but would be, which kind of topics or what topics do you suggest them to write about in South Asia for them to like make awareness or create awareness on climate change adaptation?
I think my plea is to write, first thing is to write a lot about climate change. I'll give you the recent example. We have faced the impact of El Nino in the last 2 years, that has been building up in the last few years. And as I was giving example of India itself, 330 million people were affected by drought. But if you look at the stories, media stories, there is hardly any mention of climate change, how climate change has made the natural phenomenon of El Nino worse this time. And the concoction of climate change and El Nino phenomenon, how that has multiplied impacts. The good thing is, media has talked a lot about lack of natural resource management or mismanagement of natural resources, which is good, which is important. But then that's just half of the story. What we also need to tell that we need to manage our natural resource much better. We need to fight against the real estate lobby that is occupying wetlands, that is occupying ponds and just destroying the entire natural system. But at the same time telling that we are going to face a lot more grave challenges because of climate crisis, which means that our preparation level has to be enhanced several times. And that information is not there. So one, we need to demystify what climate change is and what kind of impacts people are going to face, and then really raise an alarm that we are living in a world which is 1 degree warmer, and this warming is increasing. 2013 was the warmest year ever on record. Same was happened with 2014, 15, and 2016 already just 6 months, and it's all set to be the warmest year ever on record. So and people, we have seen so many disasters happening. Chennai floods, massive disaster we confronted with when we were in Paris during the COP time. But policymakers have again turned a blind eye to the structural problems that we need to be dealing with. We have destroyed the natural system, the water flow systems, the wetlands, and I think we need to keep hammering on this point. Sea level rise, as I was talking about. We are not seeing many stories of sea level rise. So we need to really raise an alarm. But at the same time, it's not just about all negative and all doom and gloom story. We also need to pick the positive stories. And as we have talked about several examples, communities are making a lot of efforts. There are governments who are making good efforts. Bangladesh, for example, is pioneer in early warning systems. The government in India also this time has been able to do make a lot of improvements in their early warning and evacuation systems. So and then there are also complementary capacities where you have a lot of capacity building work happening in Bangladesh. The bottom up way of building capacity. So how do we really in a region share these experiences? Which means we need to write stories in our own country. We need to write stories about what's happening in my country, and then picking up examples from the neighboring countries. Another issue that's going to be far more challenging is sharing water. We know there are conflicts between India and Bangladesh about how to share a river flow and water system. Same between India and Pakistan and India and Nepal. So and this issue is going to be far more worse with glacier melting. So how do we deal with that? So how do we bring different partners together? So media need to raise a lot of those questions and push policymakers and ask them tough questions. And as I said, but at the same time, let's also not paint all such disasters or link all the such disasters with climate change. So knowing the issue and linking where it is relevant so that action is taken, and really balancing our stories with on one hand raising an alarm, but at the same time talking about solutions which are not that sexy and not those eye-catching stories, but these are important stories to be told so that people just don't get depressed, but they're also encouraged to take action.
Yeah, and I hope we will hear a lot of stories about solutions, because we have trackers from many places around South Asia right now writing. So this is the last question we had from Climate Tracker to Harjeet, but I've been following and you had sent some questions, so trackers have been posting questions for him. So I will start with the first one, which was sent by Pari from India, and she says that she says, can you brief us about cross-border adaptation initiatives in South Asia, if any? So collaboration with countries, I guess.
There are not many initiatives on ground, but I do remember there was a project after Kosi floods in Bihar. There was a project between people in India and Nepal on how to look at early warning systems. So people living upstream were enabled with mobile technology so that they can inform people. There's a lot of problem of data sharing between countries. Governments call it classified information. So governments wouldn't share the water flow, and which means that people don't get early warning. So people decided now, because they are connected with mobile technology, so why don't we use that? So people living in upstream started informing people downstream in India that water level is rising, or there's a huge water flow, which means that it's going to reach your place in the next few hours. So be prepared and do start evacuating. So there are such projects. There are projects. So many networks. If I talk about Climate Action Network South Asia itself, that which ActionAid is member of. So there are a number of opportunities that are created for policymakers to come together, for practitioners to come together, to share knowledge, and that has been happening a lot. And we should be, of course, it's a lot, but not enough. And we should be doing it a lot more to understand different examples. As I was saying, there are complementary skills and competencies in this region. So we need to be making use of that, and we need to have a lot more projects. ActionAid got a project from Asia Foundation this time to look at water sharing, and as I was saying, water sharing is going to become a lot more complex due to climate change. So we need to look at the complexities around that. So it's about facilitating dialogues between policymakers, and also bringing communities together, because we need that bottom-up pressure as well.
Yeah, definitely. Those ventures, I mean, of collaboration, etc., they've been helping us in the past, especially in the SAARC region. As we know, the SAARC has contributed to a lot of progressive initiatives in South Asia. But the next question that we have is actually really interesting, and we're glad somebody sent that to us. It says that, are the national action plans in South Asia, including children's rights, as children will be the most affected by climate change but contributed to it the least? How can we ensure the plans are implemented? This is from by Jessica. So yeah, this intergenerational rights has been quite a big buzzword in the international policy circles, and of intergenerational equity. So in terms of adaptation, because the adaptation work will actually have to be done by the every consecutive generation for the lack of mitigation work by the current generation. So what are your thoughts on children's rights in adaptation policy?
I think in this region, there's a lot of work has happened around school safety, and the whole work on school safety, particularly from the disaster risk reduction side, has brought forward the issues of children. Unfortunately, in all disasters, we have found number of women and children as victims is disproportionately high. So we all understand that children, on one hand, are quite vulnerable to disasters and climate change impacts. But at the same time, as you said, we should not just look at children as victims, but agents of change, and they are the ones who are going to face these problems much more as they grow, and unfortunately, the climate change impacts are going to get worse. So it's really important to invest in children and their capacities and understanding. So I would say education department working in tandem with different national disaster management authorities, as we have seen in and these authorities exist in all different countries. I think they have done decent amount of work in raising awareness. And right now I'm deliberately talking of disasters, because when they talk of disasters, they talk about all kinds of disasters. Climate change is increasing the number of disasters. So I would approach this from a perspective of disasters, and I would say a lot of work has happened, but it's not enough, and it's not up to the mark, comparing to the kind of challenge we have before us. So from that point of view, we need to continue to engage with the adaptation policy making process. So DRR community has done a lot of work to highlight this issue, but at the adaptation level, we have not seen that being highlighted. Of course, when they talk about vulnerability, they do mention women, children, or different kind of castes, and even indigenous people for that matter. But in terms of implementation, I think we also need to do a lot of hand-holding, and let's also understand the way policies are being developed. In this case, it's the environmental ministry that is leading the whole adaptation policy work, whereas on DRR, so it was education ministry and several other ministries working in tandem. So we need to engage afresh with environment ministry. that has not been our target for the last several years as development community. So yes, we have achieved something, we've got good examples, we know how it works, and now that understanding has to be taken to the Environment Ministry to replicate and to adopt those good practices.
Thank you, Harjeet. We have another question from a tracker from India who asks if there are trade-offs happening in respect to biodiversity and communities adaptation. So, of course, both have to adapt to climate change, but maybe that creates some trade-offs. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's not a trade-off. It's so complementary actually, and in fact, if we are losing biodiversity, then people are becoming more vulnerable. It's not just ecosystem that becomes vulnerable; people become a lot more vulnerable. Let me take an example which is beyond climate, and I am. As you know, that I was leading the tsunami response program in Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and several examples how places where they had strong, where they had dense mangrove forest, the impact of tsunami, which was massive, was also reduced. Places where you find windbreakers, the impact of cyclone goes down. So where you have natural biodiversity, the impacts of disasters actually go down. And where you have mangroves, you have much more access to fisheries and other marine resources. So I think it's in fact a lot more complementary. More we conserve biodiversity, more we promote that, better adaptive we are. So and I don't think we need to look at one against the other. We need to find solutions where one strengthens the other. So and especially for human beings, it's important to understand that they are part of nature. So by destroying nature, they are actually it's a recipe for disaster for them in the years to come. So how do we live in harmony with nature and understand the importance of biodiversity? I think that's what we should be adopting in our strategies and implementation work.
Definitely. I mean, we witnessed a very interesting example just this month where the Assam floods resulted in such a crisis on the one-horned rhino, which is an endemic species of India. So we see how the local communities in Assam and the endemic species of the rhino and how the adaptation efforts work together in order to ensure the safety of both. So it's not necessarily either tiger or man, or it's the man versus tiger debate needs to be reduced, definitely. So the next question again we have, it's again to do with a bit of intersectionality. They're asking whether there are examples of any initiatives that ActionAid has taken, not just specifically relating to climate change, but adaptation with other areas like health. So if there are health initiatives by or poverty alleviation initiatives by ActionAid where adaptation is a prominent feature.
Well, there are a number of examples in South Asia itself. So we have a lot of projects going on. In fact, we started a project funded by British government that's happening in Nepal, Afghanistan, and then in Myanmar, which is Southeast Asia, as well as Malawi, where we have worked. And as I was explaining, that in our work we look at the interface between development and adaptation much more closely, which means that we will start with identifying risks and vulnerabilities, but we also try to understand the structural causes. So when we keep saying that poor people are more vulnerable, we also try to understand what keeps them poor and why, which are the forces that are not letting them in, becoming. Oops. Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly. Harjeet? Or maybe not now. Is it only me, Lanini? Are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, okay. So maybe he had some problems. Sorry, the ones who were listening to us. We will wait and see if he gets back his signal. It may be because of the rainy season. I'm not an expert. We only had one more question left, so if he gets back, we will try to solve this one. But meanwhile, I can just give you a little summary that I wanted to give in the end of the call. It should be ending in like 10 minutes, so I can do that now. So maybe you're wondering why are we doing this webinar, or maybe you know already, but you should know that we're here because Climate Tracker with us are doing a South Asia campaign. What does that mean? It means that we are presenting this opportunity where you can publish articles in your local, regional, national, international media that talk about climate change adaptation and 1.5 degrees, what we were discussing today, and you write it and you publish them in this kind of media. What's the point of this? So the 15 best trackers, the 15 best people writing, will get to go to the first conference that Climate Tracker will held in South Asia, which would be in Sri Lanka in October from the 14th to the 16th. And then they will also have the opportunity to join us in the 5th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum, which will also be in Sri Lanka. So the only thing you have to do to join us in this competition is to go to app.climatetracker.com app.climatetracker.org and join the campaign, publish an article that has to be published between now until the 16th of this month of August, and the best ones will be the ones joining us in this live conference. I'm not sure if Harjeet will come back or if he is trying to reach us in some other ways. But if not, we can just end the webinar here and see if he had any technical problems. I'm sorry if someone's questions were not answered. Mrinalini, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, thank you for joining us today, and for everyone who will watch this tomorrow after it's uploaded. We hope you benefit from this session. If you have any other questions, we would be delighted to forward them to Harjeet. And good luck for all the writing on adaptation. Oh, we have him back. Oh, great, he's back.
Oh. Sorry, yeah. There was I kept talking to myself probably. I don't know what you heard last.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's fine. Like, we were just now improvising and explaining some other things to the trackers. So okay. We will just not make you repeat what you were saying and just jump to our very last question, if that's fine for you, and then we can close the webinar. Sorry for like the all technical issues. So last one is from a guy from Bangladesh, and he's saying, Bangladesh is the largest delta, and the elevation is not high from sea level. So it seems that coastal people, mostly poor people, are the most vulnerable to climate change, of course. So he asks, what measures can be taken to make the community more resilient?
I think answer is very much hidden in your question itself. You said poor people are more vulnerable. So it's really important for us to understand that we also need to tackle poverty alongside. So on one hand, we need to understand the risks they face, the new risks that they face, or enhanced risks that they face due to climate change. And we also need to look at why they are far more vulnerable. Do they have sufficient access to natural resources, to skill, new knowledge that they need to have, or being part of social network and social systems? So what is missing, and what kind of new capacities and resources they need. At the same time, also looking at their economic well-being, that will also make them, will help them withstand the shocks and stresses that they're facing due to climate change. So which means that we need to tackle poverty as well as working on the capacities of people to deal with these new challenges together, and they need to go hand in hand, and one helps the other. In fact, I was giving examples of how our projects where we have worked on diversification of livelihood has not only helped in adapting people, but also it brought them out of poverty cycle. There was an example of how people don't feel the need to immigrate if they have sufficient income back home. Then they don't need to be displaced due to different climatic shocks. So it's about understanding the risks, the challenges, the structural causes that keep them poor and make them more vulnerable. So we need to understand that, and of course that does require a lot of resources. And I must say, since this is the last question, so on one hand, our own governments are responsible to protect our citizens, to provide them resources. But climate change also means we are talking of an international obligation, and that's where the role of Green Climate Fund comes in, the role of UNFCCC and the rich countries who are primarily responsible. And that's what the whole climate action is all about. It's about asking rich countries to do their bit. And when we talk about inequality, we do see global inequality that exists. So how do we see transfer of resources in terms of money, technology coming into developing countries? And then developing countries also need to be far more responsible in using those resources and making sure that their own national income is coupled with that international support, and we are doing good work on the ground and keeping our citizens informed of the new challenges and providing them new resources to deal with the climate impact. So I think we need a movement where all of us come together to deal with this massive challenge.
Thank you so much. That was a very great note, I think, to leave the discussion on with, and that was I feel inspired by that message, definitely. And I think the most important part of this webinar has been that you've emphasized the need to have human stories of actual people, that the stories of real people that are at the forefront of the adaptation debate. It's not just about degrees, or it's not about the rises in temperature or rainfall, but it's about people and how they're dealing with it on the ground. So I think that perspective is going to be of massive benefit to the trackers. And also, you've managed to touch on everything from climate finance to disaster management to seed banks to the tsunami response in Andaman and Nicobar. So I don't think we've had such a vast array of and variety of information in such a short span of time. So we can't thank you enough for that really informative session. And we're so honored that you took out the time today. So we'd like to thank you for that, and we really look forward to associating with you in the future for our journalism initiatives. Thank you so much, Harjeet.
Sure, glad to hear that was useful. Thank you very much again for having me for this session.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and see you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.